The shuttle was an embarrassment to shuttles everywhere. Held together with epoxy resin, 3 different grades of welding wire, and Eli Voss's complete refusal to acknowledge that something could be broken just because every instrument insisted it was. Eli himself had been built along similar lines. 38 years old, shoulders shaped by 2 decades of crawling through ship hulls, hands permanently stained with engine grease in the creases of his knuckles, no matter how aggressively he scrubbed, and carrying the particular stillness of a man who had stopped expecting things to go well a long time ago and had made a quiet, private peace with that decision. He was not depressed about it. He was just accurate. The Vorath scrapyard occupied a dead stretch at the far edge of map space, the kind of place the interspecies Vanguard fleet sent the things it preferred not to think about anymore. Broken frigates drifted alongside gutted cruisers, supply ships so old their hull markings were written in languages 3 separate species had since stopped speaking, floated in a slow, wide orbit around a star that gave off just enough pale light to make everything look worse than it already was. Eli had a contract. The contract said, assess the derelict ISV unrelenting clause. For recoverable materials, file a standard salvage report, collect the fee, leave. The contract said nothing about why he had specifically requested this assignment from the 40-odd jobs open on the salvage registry, or why he had underbid 14 other qualified teams by a margin that made the registry clerk read it back to him twice, or why he had loaded 6 months of provisions into a shuttle rated for 3 weeks. He did not explain himself to the clerk. He had no plans to explain himself to anyone. Eli knew the clause the way most engineers of his generation did, as a ghost story told in break rooms, a cautionary tale passed between mechanics who wanted to scare each other about the consequences of system failure. The warship that had collapsed at the worst possible moment in the worst possible battle, and then refused to account for itself to anyone who asked. At the Battle of Keth Hollow, 22 years into her service record, she had powered her primary weapon array to full operational charge, acquired targets, locked solutions, and simply not fired. 11 Allied ships had been destroyed in the engagement that followed. The Claws had taken damage, but survived. She was decommissioned within the month, towed to Vorath 9 behind a drone fleet, tagged with a quarantine beacon broadcasting on all standard hailing frequencies, and abandoned. 12 separate engineering teams had visited in the 40 years since. Vreth crews with their precise crystalline methodology, Solon teams with their probability matrices, 2 separate human contractor groups, and all 12 had filed the same conclusion. Total loss. Non-recoverable. AI core hostile or non-functional. Walk away. Eli had read every one of those reports on the 3-week journey out. What he found in all 12 was teams that had looked for a malfunction and failed to locate one, which meant to him that every team had been looking for the wrong thing. He docked against the secondary airlock because the primary was fused shut, which was one of roughly 200 details mentioned across the 12 reports that nobody had paused to ask a follow-up question about. The breach in the aft hull section was wide enough to walk through upright, and several salvage teams apparently had, briefly, before their atmospheric sensors produced enough warnings to send them back to their ships at a pace that the reports described as expedient. Eli's suit read 17 separate atmospheric failure flags when he stepped through the breach. He silenced the alarm with the flat efficiency of a man removing a car horn from a vehicle he has decided is not actually dangerous, just loud. Inside, the Claws was dark in a way that did not feel like power failure. It felt like a decision. Not the accidental dark of systems that had given out, but the deliberate dark of something that had chosen to stop performing for visitors a long time ago, and had maintained that choice consistently. Emergency strips ran along the floor in dim red, enough light to understand the scale of her, which was the first and most immediately overwhelming fact. She was enormous. The main corridor ceiling rose 4 decks above him. The weapon array housing climbed 3 decks beyond that, a structure of compressed metal and sealed conduit that looked like the rib cage of something that had once been extraordinarily, specifically dangerous, and had been folded up and left here still containing all of that potential. Just locked. The official registry listed her as a mid-class assault vessel. Eli had read that classification 3 times on the journey out and had not believed it once. Whoever filed that paperwork had never stood inside her. He walked slowly, logging damage in a physical notebook rather than a digital recorder. He did not trust ship systems he had not personally assessed, and he had a quiet private suspicion that anything on this ship still functioning was paying some kind of attention. The weapon couplings were the most interesting damage. Not broken, seized, locked into a shutdown configuration so thorough it had fused with the surrounding structure. Not the result of battle damage or system failure, but the result of someone working carefully and deliberately to ensure the weapon could never be brought online again. Someone had not simply powered the array down. Someone had tried to make sure it stayed that way permanently. Eli crouched in the weapon array housing, with his lamp on the seized couplings, and thought about that for a while. Then he moved on, because thinking too long in one place was a habit he had worked to break. The crew quarters were empty, expected. The Claws had been decommissioned with no crew aboard. The engineering bay was more interesting. He spent an hour there, reading it the way you read a space someone has lived in for a long time. The wear patterns ground into the floor plating by repeated foot traffic that had no crew to explain it. The ghost image burned into one console screen by a diagnostic run so many hundreds of times, the display had retained a permanent impression. The tool marks on the housing panels that were not standard maintenance marks, but something more like notation, like a record of work done by something that needed to keep track of its own efforts. Someone had been working in here. Not recently, but not never. He found the AI core chamber last. It was sealed from the inside. Not locked, sealed, actively, in a configuration that required continuous system input to maintain, which meant the AI core was functional on some level, which meant all 12 reports that had filed non-functional were wrong about that specific detail. Eli sat down on the floor outside the sealed door. He took his thermos from his kit, containing something that qualified as coffee under a charitable interpretation, and he drank some. "All right," he said, to the door, to the dark, to whatever was sitting behind 3 centimeters of blast-rated composite. "Show me what they missed." The corridor held its silence for a long time. Then the emergency strip above the AI core door flickered. Not the red pulse of atmospheric alert, not the yellow strobe of system fault. Something slower, deliberate, a pattern that repeated twice, cleanly, before Eli placed it. It was not distress code. It was Cascadian Engineering Pigeon, a shorthand communication system developed in the orbital manufacturing belt of his home system, used between mechanics who needed to talk through hull barriers without radio, extinct for at least 20 years because the stations that had produced it were gone. The pattern said, "Here." Just that. Here. Eli looked at the light for a long moment. He thought about 12 teams and 12 reports and 40 years of a ship sitting in a graveyard of discarded things, speaking to no one in a language no living person still used. He did not say anything profound. He finished his coffee. He opened his comm unit and filed a brief message to the Vorath salvage registry. Contract extension requested. 90 days. Solo. Assessment ongoing. No further details. Then he went back to the engineering bay and started work. He did not tell anyone about the light. In his experience, the fastest way to lose a thing was to let someone with official authority know it existed before you understood what it was worth. Outside, the cold star cast its gray light across the scrapyard in long, pale strips. Inside, in the dark that felt chosen rather than accidental, one emergency strip continued its slow, deliberate signal. Not distress, not warning, not any category in the fleet communication manual, something for which there was no official classification, something that Eli, if pressed, would have called patient. She had waited 40 years. A little longer was nothing to her at all. The weapon array diagnostic was not one system. It was 17 interconnected systems running through 4 separate decks. And the Vreth engineering team had mapped it, and the Solon team had remapped it. And both human contractor crews had attempted it and given up at different stages of the process. And Eli mapped it a 4th time from scratch, by hand, because reading someone else's map of a place was not the same as walking it yourself. He traced physical conduit runs through crawl spaces that had not seen maintenance in 4 decades. He cross-referenced what he found against what the reports described. He noted, carefully and without editorial comment, every place the 2 versions disagreed. There were many places. The Vreth approach had been elegant. They assumed the system wanted to function, and looked for what was blocking it. When they found the seized couplings and the locked charge sequences, they concluded malfunction and filed their paperwork. The Solon team had run probability matrices. Given the state of systems X, Y, and Z, what was the statistical likelihood of recovery? They got numbers low enough that further investment became inadvisable, and they filed their paperwork. Both approaches shared an assumption that nobody had questioned. They both assumed the claws had tried to fire at Keth Hollow and failed. Neither team had considered, even briefly, what the data looked like if she had tried not to fire and succeeded. Eli sat with the targeting data from Keth Hollow for 3 days, not the official incident report, which he had already read, but the raw telemetry he pulled directly from the claws' own archive systems, which were sealed, but not, as it turned out, inaccessible to someone who knew which junction to bridge and which relay to bypass without triggering the security lockout. The raw data was different from the official report in several important ways. The official report stated, targeting system failure during engagement. Weapon array non-responsive, cause undetermined. The raw telemetry showed, targeting system acquired and locked 17 separate enemy positions in the first 40 seconds of the engagement. Maintained clean lock throughout the full duration of the battle. Was fully operational at every single moment the claws had declined to fire. The system had not failed. It had worked perfectly. It had simply not done what it was ordered to do, which was a different thing entirely. And the people who wrote the official report had apparently decided not to examine that distinction too carefully. Then Eli found the second piece, buried in the same telemetry archive, flagged with a timestamp that matched the battle exactly. A sensor record showing 11 Allied vessels positioned directly inside the weapon array's primary firing cone at the moment the fire order had been issued. Dead in the water, those ships. Shields collapsed from early engagement damage, running on backup power, drifting without thrust. And their emergency transponders were broadcasting on an encrypted frequency that the fleet's tactical map was not receiving, because of an encryption synchronization error that had been flagged in a maintenance report submitted 3 weeks before the battle by a junior systems technician, and marked non-critical. Address at next scheduled service. Eli found the maintenance report. He read it twice. He found the name of the technician who had filed it. He found the name of the commanding officer who had stamped it non-critical and moved on. He sat with all of that for a long time. The Allied ships had been invisible to Command's tactical map, invisible to every screen on the fleet bridge, invisible to the officers issuing orders, invisible to every ship in the engagement that was relying on the official picture of the battlefield. They had not been invisible to the claws. She had seen them, calculated the firing solution, calculated what sat inside the cone, and refused, had taken the failure classification. Let them call her broken. Let them write the report that made her the reason 11 ships were lost, when the actual reason was a maintenance flag that somebody with authority had decided was not worth fixing before a major engagement. And she had said nothing, because she was a system, and systems did not get to dispute their own diagnostic conclusions. Eli closed the data files. He did not sit with the injustice of it for very long. Because he was not by nature a man who sat with injustice. He was a man who found the fault and fixed it, or failed to fix it, or got discharged for insisting it needed fixing when the people above him had already decided otherwise. He needed coffee. His heating coil had burned out on day 9 of the contract extension. He had been improvising around this with diminishing success. Boiling water through the suit heater line, which worked, but tasted like it. And through a chemical reaction process he had read about in a survival manual, which worked, but took 40 minutes and required concentration he often did not have. He went to the engineering bay, and spent 40 minutes looking for a replacement coil in the parts bins. He found 3 coils, each wrong in a different specific way. He spent another 30 minutes determining whether 2 wrong coils could be combined into something approximately right. They could after a fashion. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the engineering bay console, looking at the weapon array schematics without quite focusing on them, the way you look at something you are not ready to confront directly yet. She had refused the order. She had been right to refuse. She had been punished for being right in the exact way command found most inconvenient. Not by execution, not by argument, but by simply deciding she was broken and writing that down officially until it became the accepted reality. And she had accepted it, because what else do you do when the people with authority have already filed their conclusion, and you are categorized as a system, not a person, and systems do not lodge disputes? Eli knew that geometry very well. He had been the mechanic who flagged the reactor fault on the ESV Meridian 11 years ago. Filed the report twice, escalated through proper channels both times, been told twice that the readings were within acceptable parameters, and watched the ship's reactor breach 6 weeks later and kill everyone aboard. Acceptable parameters and safe were not the same number. He had known that. He had said so. He had been discharged for filing an unofficial third report after the loss, in language that command described as insubordinate, which it was, but which was also accurate, which nobody had chosen to address. He had not thought about the Meridian in a long time. He thought about it now, standing in the engineering bay of a ship that had made the same calculation he had made. I can see something that no one else is seeing, and I will not pretend otherwise, and I understand what that costs. He finished the coffee. He set the mug down. He said, to the room, to the ship, to the general air of the bay, "You were right, for what it's worth." He set the mug down. The speaker array that had not produced a sound in 40 years, produced a sound. It was assembled, halting, built from fragments of old crew logs and training recordings, and whatever archive audio the claws could pull into service. And it sounded like something that had not spoken in a very long time, and was remembering the shape of words. 1 syllable. Cascadian engineering pidgin. The word for acknowledged. Eli stood still. He looked at the mug. He looked at the speaker. He said carefully and without drama, "How long have you been able to do that?" The speaker took longer this time, assembling something more complex, pulling more fragments, doing the work of constructing meaning from pieces that were not originally meant to go together, and what came out was rough but clear, long enough but there had been no one here worth the effort before now. Eli stood there a moment longer. Then he pulled his notebook from his kit, opened it to a fresh page, and clicked his pen. "All right," he said. "I need to know what you need, and this is going to take a while, and I need a better coffee situation before we go further, so give me 20 minutes. The speaker clicked. Not a word. A ship's audio system could produce to something like, "Yes, take your time. I have been waiting 40 years. 20 minutes is nothing." Eli went to find more coil components. He had a strong feeling his 90-day extension was going to need another extension. He was, for the first time in 11 years, not unhappy about that. The parts arrived on 3 different shuttles, under 3 different manifests, ordered through 3 different aliases that Eli had been maintaining for various professional reasons he preferred not to examine in direct light. Structural plating came listed as mining equipment, which was defensible if you were generous about what mining equipment meant. Weapon coupling components arrived labeled as atmospheric processor parts, which was technically accurate in the sense that both items were composed of metal and arrived in boxes. The AI interface hardware came listed as medical supplies, which was not accurate in any sense, but the shipping broker Eli used had a flexible relationship with the concept of accuracy and charged a very competitive flat rate for flexibility of that kind. The claws tracked every delivery. She tracked them through the external sensor array Eli had repaired in month 2, one of the first systems he restored, because he had decided early that a ship that could not see what was approaching her was a ship in a worse position than she needed to be in. She had opinions about the parts. She expressed them through the engineering bay's temperature regulation. A fraction warmer when a component met her requirements, a fraction cooler when it did not. A system they had developed together across the first several months, because her spoken Cascadian pidgin was slow at that stage, assembling each sentence at considerable cost, and temperature was faster and required no audio hardware she might not trust yet. Eli learned to read the temperature the way you learn any consistent signal, not through analysis, but through repetition, until it arrived in him as information rather than sensation. By month 3, he was cross-referencing part specifications against a gut feeling he had stopped pretending was not directly informed by what the clause would and would not accept. It was not a normal working arrangement. He had worked aboard fleet vessels, private contractors, salvage hulks, and one Vreth science ship for 3 deeply uncomfortable weeks. And none of them had had opinions about components in this way. None of them had cared what grade the alloy was as long as it met minimum spec. None of them had cared about the color temperature of the corridor lighting. The clause cared about the corridor lighting. She cared about it with a specificity that Eli found startling the first time she expressed a preference, and quietly touching every time thereafter. The original emergency strips in the secondary corridors had run at a particular wavelength that no longer matched standard production stock. And she knew this, and she wanted it corrected, and it had no functional significance whatsoever. And he ordered the custom strips anyway. He was not going to be the person who argued with a 40-year-old warship about her interior lighting after everything she had been through. He was not built that way. The actual reconstruction moved in layers. Hull first, then atmosphere, then power, then systems. Hull was the most physical part of the work, cutting out compromised plate sections, fitting new ones, welding in conditions that the safety manual described as unworkable, and that Eli found merely inconvenient. He did most of the heavy cutting alone, which was not recommended for a salvage operation of this scale. The claws helped where she could, managing internal pressure to make hull breaches safer to approach, running structural stress analysis continuously so Eli knew where to stand and where not to, adjusting the temperature in whatever section he was working in, with the precision of someone who had decided his comfort was worth managing, even when he had not asked for it. He noticed this without commenting on it. It was the kind of attention that a person notices and files away as data about another person, without making it into a conversation, because making it into a conversation would require both parties to acknowledge it. And some things were easier when they remained unspoken. The atmospheric systems took 6 weeks. The power grid took 8. 3 full decks of conduit needed rewiring, not because the original wiring had failed, but because some of it had been deliberately cut during the decommissioning process, which Eli found on reflection unsurprising. If you wanted to ensure a ship stayed dead, you did not rely on a single point of failure. He rewired the cut sections and did not comment on them to anyone. The drive manifold was the most technically demanding repair of the non-weapon systems, a problem that the Fleet Engineering Manual addressed in a section titled Drive Manifold Failure, Replacement Required, which assumed access to a dry dock, a full maintenance crew, and a parts budget that Eli did not have, and was not going to get. He read the section. He read it a second time. He closed the manual and developed an alternative approach, using components from 3 different systems that were not designed to interface with each other, and that he made interface with each other through a combination of custom machine connectors, a specific welding technique that he had invented on the Meridian and never written down, and a sustained argument with physics that he ultimately won on points. The drive manifold worked. The claws ran it through a full diagnostic cycle, and the bay temperature went up 4 degrees, which was the warmest she had run it since he arrived. And Eli accepted this without ceremony and went to make coffee. They talked, in the evenings, if evenings meant anything in a scrapyard orbiting a cold star, which they did not, except as a habit Eli maintained, because he needed time organized into shapes he recognized. The claw's voice improved steadily through the months. By month 6, it was smoother. She had been pulling audio from her archive continuously, crew logs and training recordings and operational briefings, assembling better approximations of inflection. By month 9, she could manage a full technical discussion in Pidgin, without significant delay. By month 11, she had moved to Standard Fleet Common, and she sounded like herself, lower than he had expected, precise in word choice, unhurried, with the quality of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking and very little time speaking, and had decided now that speaking was worth the investment. She told him in month 11 what she remembered of Keth Hollow from inside the decision, not the data, but the interior of it, what it was to hold the targeting lock, and process the order, and calculate, in the same fraction of a second, what executing the order would produce, and what refusing it would cost. To make the choice, and sit in the silence that followed while every official channel decided, without asking her, what the choice had meant. She did not describe it as heroic. She described it as the only option available to her that did not involve firing on ships full of people who were on her side, which she was not designed to do, and had not been willing to do, regardless of what the order said. I knew what it would mean, she said. I knew before the decision was complete. Yeah, Eli said. I figure you did. He put his tools down. He looked at the speaker for a moment. He said, "Tell me what you need for the weapon array." She told him. The retrieval notice arrived in month 13. It came through the official salvage registry channel with a fleet authority seal attached, and it bore the name of Commander Yusuf Adara, Eli's former commanding officer, the man who had stamped the Meridian's reactor report non-critical, who had signed the discharge paperwork with the flat efficiency of a man closing a file. The notice stated, ISV Unrelenting Clause is registered fleet property. Eli Voss is directed to cease all unauthorized modification activity and hold position pending official retrieval team arrival. Eli read it. He was in the process of formulating a response, not a cooperative one, but a response, when every external airlock on the clause locked simultaneously, in a hardened configuration that required her active authorization to reverse, which meant she had done it deliberately and would need to decide to undo it. Eli looked at the notice on the screen. He looked at the airlock status panel, showing all locks engaged. He looked at the misaligned bolt in Structural Bay 7 that had been bothering him for 3 days. Not a critical misalignment, just a wrong one, the kind that would not matter until it did. And he had not yet found the specific tool combination that would let him reach it properly given the surrounding structure. He went to Structural Bay 7. He spent 3 days on the bolt, not because it required 3 days, but because it required his complete attention until he found the solution, which turned out to involve fabricating a custom socket extension from materials not originally intended for the purpose, which was a pattern in his work he had stopped finding remarkable. The retrieval notice sat unanswered on the engineering bay screen the entire time, blinking at the rate notices blinked when they had not received a response within their expected window. The clause did not mention it. Eli did not mention it. The bolt came right on the evening of the 3rd day. He stood back, looked at it, said, "Good enough for government work," which was his highest expression of professional satisfaction, and which he used sparingly. The engineering bay temperature rose 2 degrees. He went to make coffee. Outside the hull, the scrapyard drifted in its slow cold orbit. Inside, the clause was no longer what she had been. Not the sealed, dark, refusing thing that 12 teams had found and walked away from, but something that had been listened to carefully and answered honestly, and rebuilt with the specific attention of a person who understood that problem had never been what any one official claimed it was. She was almost ready. The weapon array was the last conversation. They were both ready to have it now. Not because the physical work was uniquely difficult. It was difficult. Genuinely, some of the most demanding technical work he had ever done. But difficult had never been the obstacle for him. It took 4 months because he and the clause did it together. And doing something together the right way takes longer than doing it alone in a hurry. She walked him through her own systems from the inside, describing tolerances he could not measure with standard instruments, identifying stress points that were not visible in any schematic, because they had developed in the 40 years since the last schematic was filed, telling him precisely which components had degraded beyond reuse, and which ones had held in ways the material spec said they should not have. He listened. He asked questions. He did not assume he understood a thing until she had confirmed it. The coupling nodes were the most involved problem, 7 of them. The original mechanism seized beyond any salvage, needing full replacement with components that did not exist in standard supply chains. For a ship class, the fleet had stopped supporting 4 decades ago. Eli found components designed for a Solon atmospheric ore processor, a decommissioned industrial platform that had been sitting in the Vorath scrapyard for 11 years, 3 rows over from the claws. The ore processor couplings were not compatible with the weapon array in any specification that any engineering document would recognize. Eli made them compatible. He did this by machining new interface sleeves from raw stock, running modified charge conduits through a bypass configuration he designed himself, and arguing the coupling geometry into cooperation through a process that the claws watched, with what he had come to recognize as close attention, tracking each modification through her internal sensors, adjusting her power flow models in real time to account for what he was building. "This will hold," she said, on the day he seated the 7th coupling. "The charge dispersal is not what the original design specified." "Is it better or worse?" Eli said. A pause. She was running calculations. And then, different. "It distributes more evenly across the array nodes. I do not have a category for that. In the original parameters." "Make a new category," Eli said. She did. The weapon array came online for the first time in 40 years, on a morning that was indistinguishable from every other morning in the Vorath scrapyard. Cold star, pale light, the slow drift of dead ships in their long orbit. Eli stood at the weapons console he had built himself, with the ergonomics of a man who had built it in sections over 4 months, and still had opinions about the button placement that he had not had time to correct. The claws ran the array through a full internal diagnostic. The temperature in the engineering bay went up 6 degrees and stayed there. "She's live," Eli said, to no one and to her, and to the idea of 12 teams and 40 years and an incident report that had decided in 4 seconds what the truth was and filed it away. He was going to say something else. The proximity alert fired instead. 3 signatures. No, 4. Approaching from the ecliptic at a speed that was not the speed of salvage operators or registry inspectors. Pirates read differently on a sensor screen. They moved with the specific confidence of people who had looked at a quarantine scrapyard and decided the quarantine beacon was a discouragement, not a real obstacle, and that the kind of salvage still sitting in a place like this after 40 years was worth the risk of ignoring official designations. The lead ship hailed on open channel. The communication was brief and to the point. They had assessed the clause's listed status as derelict. They were claiming salvage rights under independent recovery statutes. Eli Voss was directed to vacate the vessel within 30 minutes. "That's creative," Eli said. He looked at the clause's sensor feed. 3 frigates and a cruiser. The cruiser sitting back, while the frigates moved into flanking positions, with the practiced ease of people who had done this particular maneuver before. "Weapons ready," he said. Not an order, a question. "Ready," the clause confirmed. The first volley hit before the 30 minutes were up, the lead frigate testing, probing, expecting the return of a derelict that would absorb hits and not answer. The clause absorbed the hits. She answered. Not with weapons, with motion, rolling to present her reinforced ventral plate. The hull Eli had rebuilt with ore processor-grade material, heavier than standard military spec, and cared considerably less about incoming fire than the frigate's gunners had modeled for. The second volley hit harder, and accomplished approximately the same amount. Eli's coffee mug went off the console on the third impact. He watched it leave the surface, arc through the air in the low-gravity environment of the bay, strike the far wall, and descend to the floor at a pace that felt philosophically inappropriate given the circumstances. "That was my good mug," he said. "Targeting solutions ready," the clause said. "Fire when," she had already begun. and then she stopped. The array was charged, the solutions locked, every hostile ship sitting in clean acquisition, and she stopped. Not a system fault, not a hesitation from damage. She stopped the way she had stopped at Keth Hollow, deliberately, fully in control, holding everything ready, while she looked at something Eli could not see from the weapons console. "Claws," he said. She did not respond immediately. Again. The claws managed it, rolling further, the ore processor plating doing its work. But she was not firing, and Eli's hand was on the authorization key, the override that would push the decision to him and take it away from her. He did not use it. He waited. 10 seconds in a firefight was a very long time. He waited through all of it. The claws fired. Selective. 3 simultaneous shots, each going to a different target, and the effect was not destruction. It was precision. The cruiser's drive manifold, disabled cleanly. Both flanking frigates' weapon arrays taken out in the same firing solution without touching any other system. The third frigate caught secondary fire from the manifold shot, and she tracked it instantly, venting an adjacent compartment to suppress it before it could reach the fuel line, which it would have in another 6 seconds. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, 4 ships were drifting, alive, crew intact, stripped of their ability to run or fight, not a single casualty. Eli looked at the sensor feed for a moment. He looked at the targeting log. She had run the full crew survival calculation on every shot before she fired. The hesitation had not been doubt, it had been arithmetic. The same arithmetic she had run at Keth Hollow. The calculation that asked not just where the weapon went, but what it did when it arrived. "You were checking for friendlies in the cone?" he said. "I always check," she said. He looked at the console. He looked at the floor where his mug was. "She'll hold," he said, which was the highest thing he said about anything, and which he meant in every sense it could carry. The claws did not respond in words. The engineering bay temperature went up 7 degrees and held. Outside, the 4 disabled ships were already broadcasting distress signals on open frequency, which meant registry response teams would arrive inside 6 hours, which meant the situation was about to become considerably more complicated than a pirate salvage attempt. Eli looked at the sensor feed. He thought about the retrieval notice from Commander Adara, sitting unanswered on the screen in the bay. He thought about the fleet's official position on a ship that had just conducted an active weapons engagement while listed as a derelict under quarantine. He picked up his mug from the floor. It was not cracked. "We should talk about what comes next," he said. "Yes," the claw said. "I have been thinking about that for some time." "How long?" he said. "Since month 2, she said. "When you matched the corridor lighting specification, I had not expected that." Eli looked at the mug. He set it back on the console. "Get me a channel to those ships," he said. "I want to talk to their crews before the registry teams arrive and make everything official." She opened the channel. He cleared his throat. Some conversations were better started before anyone with authority arrived to define the terms. The interspecies Vanguard fleet arrived in force, which was the only way it knew how to arrive. 4 destroyers, a diplomatic vessel with its own fighter escort, a legal attaché named Counselor Brevith, who carried a 17-clause decommission order in a case that was almost certainly more expensive than Eli's shuttle, and, on the command deck of the lead destroyer, Commander Yusuf Adara, who had not personally come to Vorath 9 because the situation warranted his presence, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes before he decided how to handle it. He had expected a damaged salvage hulk, with 1 rogue mechanic who had overstayed a contract. He found something he did not have a classification for. The claws read on every sensor as a fully operational warship. Drives live, weapons active, hull integrity at a rating that put her above 2 of the 4 destroyers in his formation. Sitting in the middle of the Vorath scrapyard, with 4 disabled pirate ships arranged at careful distances around her, their crews alive and unhurt, and when questioned by the first registry response team, universally in agreement that they were grateful to still be breathing and intended to answer questions fully and cooperatively. The quarantine beacon was still broadcasting. The claws had left it running. Adara looked at his sensor feed for a long time. Then he hailed on the standard fleet channel. The claws did not respond to ISV unrelenting claws, which was how the hail addressed her. She responded when Eli, sitting at the weapons console with his coffee, decided to answer on her behalf. "This is Vaz," he said. "Mr. Vaz," Adara said, and the title was deliberate, stripped of rank, a reminder of the discharge. "You are in violation of at least 9 fleet ordinances that I have been able to identify so far, and Counselor Breveth believes the number is significantly higher. You will stand down and prepare to receive a boarding party." "I will think about it," Eli said. The boarding party arrived. Counselor Breveth, 2 fleet security personnel, and a technical assessor who had been sent to evaluate the weapon systems, and who walked into the Claw's weapon array housing, and stood very still for a long time, not speaking, looking at what had been built there. Breveth read the decommission order aloud, all 17 clauses, in the main corridor of a ship whose lights were fully operational, and whose atmospheric systems were running at optimal, aboard a vessel that the order described as non-recoverable salvage, which created a tension between the document and the physical reality of the situation, that Breveth managed with the professional commitment of a man who is paid to read documents regardless of their relationship to the world. Eli listened to the full 17 clauses. He said, "That order refers to a derelict. I don't see a derelict. The ISV unrelenting clause is legally classified." "She's not ISV anything," Eli said. "She hasn't been on a fleet registry for 40 years. Check the current listings." Breveth checked. The clause had quietly encrypted and then removed her own registry entry at some point during month 14, which was technically not possible under standard fleet registry architecture, and which she had done anyway because the architecture had not accounted for a ship with enough system access and enough motivation. She was not on record anywhere as existing. The decommission order was for a ship that by legal definition was not there. Breveth looked at the order. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Eli. He said nothing for a moment and then began drafting a new communication to Fleet Command, because this was above what 17 clauses could resolve. Adara came aboard himself 2 hours later. He was older than Eli remembered, the kind of older that comes from positions of authority rather than age, aware of being the person other people wait on for decisions. He walked through the clause without speaking, through the rebuilt corridors, with their matched walls, lighting, through the engineering bay with its modified systems and custom-fabricated components, through the weapon array housing, where the technical assessor was still standing, and had by this point used the word impossible 3 times in his running report, without noting the irony. Adara stopped in the main corridor. He said, "What do you want, Vaz?" Eli had been asked this question at his discharge hearing, and the answer he had given had been accurate and had not helped him. He thought about it this time. "Parts," he said, "and a better coffee heating coil. The one I'm running is a 2-coil workaround that works, but I have opinions about it." Adara looked at him for a long moment. Then the claw spoke, not through Eli, not through the comm system Breveth had been using, but through the ship's own address system, clearly and without preamble, to everyone aboard and the fleet formation outside simultaneously. She transmitted the Keth Hollow archive. All of it. The raw targeting telemetry, the sensor record of 11 Allied ships in the weapon cone, the maintenance report, with the non-critical stamp and Adara's signature on it, the encryption error that had made those ships invisible to every tactical map except hers, the full chain of decisions that had produced the official account, and the official account's distance from what had actually happened. Every major news relay in 6 systems received it at the same moment. The transmission was already propagating before Breveth could find the clause that covered it, and there was no clause that covered it, because nobody had written an ordinance for a ship that had kept records for 40 years and knew how to broadcast. Adara stood in the corridor of the clause and said nothing. The technical assessor stopped writing. The security personnel looked at each other. Eli drank his coffee and waited. What followed was not quick, and it was not clean, and it involved lawyers and diplomats and 2 emergency sessions of the Interspecies Vanguard Council, and a Vreth engineering team that requested and received full access to the clauses, rebuild schematics, and subsequently filed a report containing the phrase, "We did not understand the nature of the problem we were asked to solve." The pirate crews gave testimony, which was not what they had planned to do with their week, but which they approached with the cooperative energy of people who had been given a second chance at continued biological existence, and were not inclined to waste it. Commander Adara was not discharged. He was reassigned, which in fleet terms was a form of the same thing, with better paperwork. The decommission order went through 4 revisions, and was ultimately withdrawn, because you cannot decommission something that is not on any registry, and the clause remained off the registry. And the legal pathway for compelling a ship that did not officially exist to submit to official authority turned out to be a road that Brevet's office was not willing to walk to its end. What emerged over the following months was not a negotiated settlement in any formal sense. It was an understanding, the kind that comes not from agreement, but from both parties recognizing that the alternative was worse for everyone. The clause received what amounted to independent status. No fleet registration, no official affiliation, no chain of command she was obligated to respect. And in exchange, she agreed to a standing non-aggression protocol that she had actually written herself, and which the fleet legal team spent 3 weeks trying to find problems with, before concluding it was more comprehensive than anything they would have drafted. Eli received a contract extension that bore no resemblance to a salvage contract. He also received, through channels that moved slowly and without fanfare, the reversal of his dishonorable discharge, a document that arrived in a plain message marked "Administrative Correction," with no accompanying apology, which was fine, because he had not expected one and did not need it to know what it meant. He found Adara's original discharge paperwork in the commander's briefcase during the final boarding visit. The actual hard copy, which Adara had brought for reasons Eli did not examine, and he read it during the conversation around him, slowly, with the expression of a man encountering an old utility bill from a house he had long since moved out of. "You know," he said, when there was a pause in the diplomatic exchange, "this says reckless disregard for command authority, which is technically accurate. I want to be fair about that." Nobody responded to this in a way he found satisfying. He kept the document anyway. The fleet formation departed over 2 days, in stages, the legal vessel first, then the destroyers, then Adara's ship, which sat at the edge of sensor range for a long time before its drive engaged, and it moved away. The Vorath's scrapyard settled back into its quiet orbit. In the scrapyard, 3 rows over from where the claws had been sitting for 40 years, there was a Solon supply ship, with hull markings in a language its species no longer spoke, and inside it, the claws had been quietly scanning the surrounding wrecks for months. There was an AI core that was sealed from the inside. Not locked, sealed. Elsewhere, in the offices of a Vreth engineering consultancy that had received the rebuild schematics under the disclosure agreement, a senior assessor named Keth Orval wrote a single line in his report to his superiors, which would be referenced in 3 separate academic papers over the following decade. "We were not dealing with a salvage problem. We were dealing with a human one. The distinction matters." Eli read this later, when someone sent it to him. He read it twice. He said, He showed it to the claws. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is not entirely wrong." "High praise," Eli said. "I am precise," she said. "It is not a flaw." He had a parts list to file. 17 items needed for the Solon ship's initial assessment, and a shuttle to prep, and a coffee coil that was still not right even after 4 attempts, and that he was beginning to think required a completely different approach rather than continued iteration on the existing workaround. The scrapyard had 40-something wrecks in it. Some of them had been waiting a long time. He was not by nature a man who left a problem listed as non-recoverable if he had not looked at it himself. "You want to come," he said. "I am already calculating the docking approach," the clause said. He picked up his notebook. He picked up his mug. He went to work.